entity, comprised of hundreds of species from across the cosmos, each priding itself on its progressiveness, its ability to maintain harmony and avoid violent conflict. For many in the Council, war and brutality were relics of a primitive past abandoned alongside early technologies and left behind as civilizations advanced. So, when the Council finally invited Earth, a world classified as a death world due to its high gravity, erratic climate, and dangerously evolved wildlife, there was curiosity, skepticism, and even fear. Humans, the Council members had heard, had managed to survive and even thrive on a planet that was hazardous beyond imagination. But their background remained shrouded in mystery. Representatives from species who viewed peace as the pinnacle of achievement came together in the Grand Chamber to formally welcome humanity. Among them was Kairali, a member of the Andori, a species of sentient plant beings who had never engaged in a conflict for any resource, and Jaroviks of the Erotians, a species that had evolved past conflict altogether. For these beings, the very concept of organized violence was as foreign as their anatomy was to humans. They had only known controlled disputes, resolved through ritual or diplomacy. Humanity's ambassador, Major Alex Carter, stood at the podium, aware of the weight of history he carried on his shoulders. As a representative of Earth, he knew he would have to answer for his species past the good and the bad. He began with an overview, describing how early humans had faced relentless natural threats, predators, harsh environments, and scarce resources. Humanity's survival had been hard-won, and its evolution marked by adaptation and resilience. But then Carter paused, preparing for the part of his presentation that he knew would shock his alien audience. On Earth, survival wasn't easy, he said carefully. Our ancestors learned to fight for what they needed. From basic tools, we developed weapons not just for hunting, but for protection. And, eventually, for warfare. The holoprojector behind him displayed a timeline of human history, moving from early tribes defending territories to the structured battles of ancient empires. The audience watched in silence, their biologies reacting visibly to the images: organized rows of soldiers, gleaming swords and shields, cities burning under siege. To species who had never known anything beyond ritual disputes, this history was bewildering. Jaroviks, an Orotien with pearlescent, shell-like skin, raised a question in the Council's universal language. Ambassador Carter, he began, his voice resonant with disbelief, are you suggesting that your kind would take life for territory? For power? To beings like Jaroviks, who had evolved without conflict, the idea of killing was incomprehensible. Carter nodded, the weight of his answer heavy in the air. Yes, he replied, with a gravity that matched the shocked expressions around him. Our world was harsh, our resources limited. And sometimes, survival seemed to demand terrible choices. As the presentation continued, Carter moved on to Earth's more recent wars. He spoke of the Industrial Age, where advances in technology brought humanity unprecedented tools not only for creation but for destruction. The audience recoiled as scenes of World War I appeared, the black and white images of soldiers in trenches, mud, and gas masks juxtaposed with the relentless march of tanks. For the aliens, whose own conflicts had been swiftly resolved through diplomacy, the idea of total warfare was unthinkable. The concept that entire nations would be mobilized to fight, with civilians left as collateral, left them speechless. Then Carter introduced World War II. He explained the global scale of the conflict, the alliances forged, and the atrocities committed. When he reached the subject of the Holocaust, the entire room seemed to freeze, horrified by the reality that humans could inflict such suffering upon each other based on ideology and prejudice. This was our darkest moment, Carter said, voice low but resolute. It's something we carry with us, a part of our history that we will always remember and never repeat. He showed images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki next, explaining how nuclear weapons had been used, ending the war at a devastating cost. A representative from the Literi, a species with a highly communal culture, emitted a wave of empathic dismay. And yet you survived this era? They asked, their thoughts echoing across the room in waves. Your people didn't give in to despair? Carter explained that humanity's endurance was often as much a burden as a blessing. Our history is painful, but each tragedy taught us something, he said, describing how the horror of these wars had spurred humans to create institutions to promote peace, like the United Nations, and to pursue rights for all people, regardless of nationality, race, or creed. Yet, the questions continued. When he spoke about the Cold War, Carter sensed the growing disbelief among his audience. The idea that humans had lived under the constant threat of mutual annihilation left the council stunned. Mutually assured destruction, Carter explained, was the only way we could keep ourselves from destroying one another. It forced us to come to the table and find ways to talk, even with those we called enemies. A representative from the Elysia, a species that considered violence taboo and abhorrent, spoke up. Ambassador Carter, how can a species that has endured such violence still aspire to peace? Carter paused, considering his words carefully. Because we understand the cost of violence better than anyone. We know the weight of war, the toll it takes. Our history taught us resilience, but it also taught us empathy and a desire to prevent future suffering. To close his presentation, Carter shared images of Earth's modern movements for peace and diplomacy, the Berlin Wall coming down, peace treaties being signed, protests against wars, and organizations devoted to human rights. He explained how humans had channeled their instincts for conflict into constructive forms, fighting poverty, disease, and inequality. We still have a long way to go, he admitted, but every day, we work to change. To rise above the darkest parts of ourselves and build a future that's better than our past. By the end of the presentation, the council was silent. For many, it was a sobering revelation. They had come expecting a primitive species, one hardened by a hostile world, but they found something deeper, a people scarred by their history, yet determined to rise above it. They saw a species that had endured and learned from more hardship than they could imagine, one that carried its history as both a warning and a guide. Finally, Jarovic spoke again, his tone softened, thoughtful. Perhaps there is much we can learn from humanity, he said slowly, for you have faced trials that we cannot even fathom. And yet, here you stand, advocating for peace. Around the chamber, heads nodded in agreement, and a sense of respect began to fill the room. As Carter stepped away from the podium, he felt a mixture of relief and pride. Humanity's history was painful, and the weight of that past was often overwhelming. But in sharing their darkest moments, he had shown the council something unique about humanity: the strength to endure, the ability to learn, and the capacity to hope. The galaxy would no longer view Earth merely as a death world. Instead, they would see humanity for what it truly was: a species determined to grow, change, and build a future worthy of the stars.